I'm Gaby Agis, and I had the good fortune, I suppose, to my father was a sculptor, and he was at Butler's Wharf and a long time member really of the community down there. Although I don't really think they thought of themselves as a community at that point. But when sadly Butler's Wharf was no longer possible, and all the artists and X6 had to get out, my dad, along with quite a few people, Stuart Brisley, Richard Wilson, Ingrid Pollard, and the X6 people, and I think there were more, started to look for an alternative space. So I was sort of a teenager when my dad was at Butler's Wharf, maybe late 70s. Can't remember the actual dates. But anyway, I do remember him telling me they found this incredible building in the East End by the canal. So there was a huge amount of excitement. And I remember that part of it was going to be a continuation really of X6, different, but a continuation. So I do remember the early kind of rumours, and then the actual findings and the actual transference of that space coming into fruition. I think that kind of dovetailed with me kind of finishing some training at the place and then going to New York. So kind of by the time I came back, that was a real kind of possibility of a space. The only other space really that was really up and running then was Riverside Studios, which was a great kind of hotbed of dance activity, both in the London scene and also people from New York who are coming over or further afield. So it was really great that there was a space, you know, there was stuff at Drill Hall, but there was a space in the East End that was really for us, the dance community of London at that time.
So when you arrived back in London from New York, what did you get up to at Chisenhale? What were you doing?
So I think in the early days, I was occasionally go to social functions, like we'd have meetings, but they were really like, you know, people sitting around discussing maybe the next copy of New Dance magazine, or there was a lot right now I remember how to make a collective, who, you know, what those roles were going to be divided up into. But I think very early on, I wasn't really so much in those early workings. I was more just starting to make, I guess I was working for several choreographers. Definitely Sue McLennan, she would have rehearsed there. Rosemary was more at Riverside. And then also I was dancing with Michael. So I was dancing for a lot of different choreographers. So they'd either work at Riverside or Chisenhale. Yeah, that was the main rehearsal spaces. And then I suppose I was also 83, 84 starting to make my own work. So that was a space where I would perform in other people's work, I'd perform in my own work. If there was some workshops happening, can't remember, Mary Focuson, she would come up from Dartington. Did Steve teach there? I can remember Steve Paxton, but I remember in Riverside teaching, but also at Rotherhithe, where Dartington used to have a space. There were just workshops happening quite informally, but until this whole health and safety, because of the fire escape, it couldn't really be that public. Yeah. But I do remember performances happening. Yeah, so I think in terms of the lofts in New York that I've been working in, you know, Chisenhale to this day still has that incredible floor, that incredible feeling, never had any mirrors, really promotes the ethos really of some of the work that I and the community were interested in and are still interested in. It's got a beautiful quality of sound, light. You know, when you're in that studio and especially if it's warm, you open the doors, you've got an amazing cityscape, and you've got the park on the other side and the canal. I think the fact that it's on the top floor, it's kind of like suspended in time and in place. And I think the kind of level of concentration you can get in that space is really profound. And I haven't been to some of the new spaces, but I'm really aware of, it isn't a space within a, it is, it is an organization, but it isn't a space within an institution. And increasingly, I think where and how you make work has a big effect on the kind of work you make. So I kind of feel the kind of work that I'm interested in making, the kind of participation of where the audience are and how they are, relies heavily on the environment. So Chisenhale really does have a huge part to play, not just in the development of the community and the work, the dance community, but also in the kind of work historically and also now people want to present, in what way they want to present it.
Yeah, the space itself, the physicality of the space is so important, and at the time obviously was so important just for having actual space, and
Absolutely.
like you say, outside of the institution as well, and everything that represented.
But I think it's still the case, and it's only in my 40 years history that I can articulate this. Of course, when I was a young woman in my early 20s making work, I couldn't really articulate anything, and that's why I probably danced to the degree I did. But I guess having been quite affected by my father in terms of where he lived in X6 and just like the landscape. A great friend of mine who's an architect, she grew up in London in the same period as me, and it was like London was your playground. So you navigated the streets, you know, you were lucky enough to have that kind of freedom. And I think that spills over a bit into those spaces. But curiously enough, you think there would be more spaces like Chisenhale. There's not, you know, and I sometimes think, you know, definitely like it's one of the few spaces in Europe, and then I think it's one of the few places in the world really that is, there are more artist studios, visual artists, you know, but I just think, you know, it is really, and has always been, it ducked and dived to sort of determined by the funding policies. Sometimes you'd have like people who are more artistic directors, or you know, there would be more heavy on the, and you know, marketing officers, but on the whole it does have that feeling of being owned, or being owned by the community, by the collective, by the members, however you want to determine that. And I think the space has not changed, and that's why it resonates in this way with the kind of work definitely that I'm interested in being part of.
Because like you say, the organisation itself is obviously going to be affected by politics and changes in arts policy and funding, but and you know, there's always this question of who are we and what is a collective and how do we run. You know, you were talking about those conversations of how to make a collective, and I suppose that's the nature of a collective, isn't it? It's always going to change depending who's in it. But the fact that, like you say, that the space itself, the thing that sort of holds everyone, has remained the same, and that's really powerful.
Absolutely. You know, if you think about, you know, those amazing floorboards that were transported from X6, and it has a clarity, the space has a clarity. I mean, I definitely still teach there, lead weekend workshops, and I definitely take other people's workshops and have hired the space to use for rehearsals. And it has, I mean, obviously I have a nostalgic historical memory as well, but it does have, like, I think for me, it's basically the best space. I mean, as I'm a person that's still very much moving still, the possibility of actually dancing in a space. I mean, it is too cold in the winter, but it is a space that continues to really allow a certain kind of investigation and a certain kind of concentration.
Could you talk about some of those early works that you performed at Chisenhale?
Yeah, so I was definitely in other people's work. Then my own work, I made kind of probably the first kind of work I made was this duet for myself and Helen Rousel called Close Streams. And we performed it a number of times at Riverside, at a festival in Holland or Belgium, Drill Hall. I think that was a benefit for New Dance magazine or something. Dartington Festival. And we performed it at Chisenhale. And sadly, Helen wasn't well. So my dad had the studio at the top. And so he had access to this incredible roof, which is the roof of Chisenhale Dance Space. And so I didn't really want to do it in the space on my own. And so I had, at the last minute, had this idea to take everybody up to the roof. And it was kind of like the idea that it was water. So the idea was the reflection of me was the duet. And it was great. And it was a very small audience, as audiences tended to be in those days. But there were quite a few critics. So it was like mad. I think Jan Parry was there. Was she the Observer? But John Percival was there, who was from the Times. And so he wrote this quite glowing review. But for some reason, someone picked up on it. And then it was in Sue's Corner in Private Eye with this little cartoon of me. Doing this dance. So it was a little like anecdotal story about my time performing. And then the other piece that really resonates, which, you know, I've had the kind of good fortune in a way to bring it back into being, is this piece for 13 women called Shouting Out Loud, with a soundtrack by the Raincoats by Anna da Silva. So and it was very moving because we performed that piece there. I remember it very vividly. We performed at the ICA and at Riverside, and then we did it at Chisenhale, and then 2015 we reconstructed it, and some of the original performers were in it. So that was kind of like, just one of those moments where time, you know, that piece has a sort of timeless element, but to have people who were in that piece and then it be in the same space, and then have people who, you know, were in their 20s in that piece. So it kind of did this amazing thing. And people, I think a couple of people had seen it and they were like crying. Wow. There were a few tears probably amongst the performers, like Mary and Jessie and Lucy, the performers from that time. You turn around and 40 years has gone, and you're doing this piece, which is a very collective piece, and something about time passing and womanhood and solidarity, and some of the issues that young women deal with now still being kind of resonating. So it had this massive, and of course Chisenhale was pivotal to something about intimacy, something about proximity, something about there's a kind of, when people go up those stairs and go into the space, if they haven't been to Chisenhale before, it's a bit like a special event.
Yeah.
You're not sure what you're going to get, which reminds me of seeing stuff in New York, you know, in the early 80s, late 70s, where you're sort of on a quest and it's all a bit dark and dangerous, but you come up some stairs into a space and someone performs something or offers something. Mm-hmm. So I think I kind of like the sense of the unknown at Chisenhale, that there's a sense of you're not really sure what's going to happen.
Yeah, but your work does seem very responsive to what's going on.
Definitely. I mean, I think I was thinking two things. Of course, the world then that London was, where people were squatting or housing association, everything was very cheap. So there was a possibility of making things. So if you did have to pee in a bucket, you didn't really mind, you know, because you're probably peeing in a bucket at home, you know. So I think expectations of living standards were very high. And, you know, like, I don't remember anyone having a car. I just don't remember anyone having even a bathroom. I mean, we did have bathrooms, but quite a lot of us went to bath houses to get a bath, or at Riverside there were showers. But yeah, I think I've always been politically kind of motivated, like a lot of the X6 people, and I've always like been on marches and protests, and that's always been part of my life. And so I was aware of it, but not to such a degree I am now, when I can see the resonances of the political landscape coming into my work in terms of imagery or sensation, and then I think there's this underlying kind of quest for me, which is around intimacy and around softness of power. And that's something that I've always sort of been attracted to, but now I'm able to articulate it and see that it actually is behind my work and behind my moving. Like, as you move into your older, mature life, how is it possible to continue dancing? And so those are big kind of questions for me, and I think they've always been there, but they're coming more to the foreground or the prominence. But I think the political landscape, it's a duality, isn't it? It's not like you're making work around the subject material, but you're living in the world, and you can't help but be affected by what's going on. I was in the Still Mauve collective, which was Silver Hallett, the flute player, Clive Bell, myself, Jessie Loeb, was Mary. But we used to rehearse in not, well, sometimes we would rehearse in X6, but then we'd work in the floor below as well, which was completely dark. And we'd do these like 5-hour-long rehearsals, in the dark. And the crossover with the London Musicians Co-op and the Film Co-op, that was also quite kind of fertile. And I think it was just like, you just always wanted to kind of connect with other people in other fields. It wasn't like, it wasn't like a singular voice in terms of what dance was or what it could be. It was like within a whole kind of globe of thinking at that time. And then with people like Anna Furse, much more in terms of theatre and the words, and then Chris Cheek with his poetry. And I think for me, in the way I've been brought up as a child, but then also, when I went to school, Rosemary Butcher was my teacher, was my dance teacher. So like improvisation was like, it was just what you did. You made up dances and you improvised them. I mean, so then I think the generation before me, they were radically and defiantly rejecting the hierarchy and the ways of working. Whereas for me, I didn't have to reject that. It was what I was doing. So I think, I had a bit more of a traditional training at the place, and I was terribly unhappy, but I'd already been to Dartington, and I already sort of was around Rosemary and then New York. And so improvisation was always my thing. It wasn't like I found it. It was like there. So I didn't really have to reject anything particularly. I mean, there were other things I was trying to reject. There was a little bit of difficulty, which is quite interesting to reflect on now for me, because I was just in the right place at the right time, and I was very photogenic. So I did a lot of modeling, and I worked in, I made a lot of music videos, and I did a lot of different, it was extremely, and I had managers. So that ethos didn't sit too well with the other ethos. And I remember feeling quite conflicted about that. And I kind of, to some degree, I still do, because it was a real shock for me. If you can imagine, you're in Chisenhale, you're rummaging around in the dark, you're kind of doing your thing, and then suddenly you're in all these fashion shoots and being flown all over the world. And you're getting huge amounts of publicity. And that was difficult for me personally to navigate. So the later part of the 80s, I really wasn't around Chisenhale, and it wasn't it was like my life was moving so fast, and it was so much to cope with. For me, that was a really interesting juxtaposition, dilemma, conflict. It's like, how can you call yourself a feminist? How can you make this work? And then you're doing X, Y, and Z. How can you do that? Yeah, it was a transition coming out of that and deciding to do things very differently, because of course I burnt out, and that's what nobody really tells you. But I think I can only speak about this now because it's so far away and I can see it. But it was hard because this was the work. My work didn't change. It still was underpinned by these values, and it's really interesting that relationship between the external and the internal. So I wasn't really around. Occasionally I'd dip in and out, but like after like probably 85, I wasn't really around Chisenhale, because it was just like, I mean, that I saw that as my community, but I just wasn't available. I was just like on another strata. And then I got much more involved in the 90s. I was on the board, and then I was a chair for a while, and I was a member, and coming back and forth. But it means so much to me, and it has meant so much to me as a kind of place. It is like a home, and I'm sure other people have spoken about it in a way, because dancing for me is kind of everything. So places to dance become like really, really precious, and I just hope it can always be there without being too nostalgic.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of answers my last question as well, was how would you describe Chisenhale at the time?
I mean, like, I'm sure, like cold, dark, run down, secretive, exciting. And then once you got into the space with people, then people's enthusiasm. It's like there is a sense of fight, because essentially you're always slightly on the outside looking in. So even though I think that word radical has been used so much for Chisenhale, but I think because it truly is a ever morphing, ever changing organization led by artists, or influenced by artists, or directed by artists. It's got that possibility that it can never be one thing. So it's not particularly static, and it shouldn't be. They were pioneers, like the new dance movement. Those the people a generation earlier than me, like Mary and Emmeline and all those people. Maybe in context to now, it's important to talk about, but I went to a youth group at school, London Youth Dance Theatre, which was on Commercial Road in the girls' school there, with two women in my teens. And all my other dancing friends in that company were Black. And my younger brother was always at the Oval House, which was very mixed but very Black. And so that was also interesting to me, because I was amongst friends who were Black, and on all the marches for Rock Against Racism, and all those pivotal moments. And yet the scene at Chisenhale was very white. So that was also something quite startling. But for me, I sort of traversed those worlds, and I knew it would change, in that the spaces crossing over would become less white. The demographics of people using Chisenhale has changed, and should change, and has changed. But just sort of, it was noticeable. But that's the other thing, just the last maybe thing to say, there were so few of us. Like, you could put up one hand, maybe two, and you could count everybody. There was just like not many of us doing it. there was a pool of people, but it wasn't many people, if you really think about it. I mean, there's all, like, we hadn't joined the EU at that point, you know, we didn't have freedom of movement. I think with that, why it probably feels like homemade is because the community was literally so small. But it is interesting, the landscape that has changed and it's just glorious. It's just really glorious.